Hey everyone, Eric here. Did you know that we produce a daily email newsletter on everything going on in the China-Africa space? It covers all angles of the China-Africa story, from debt to diplomacy to tech, media, culture, you name it, we cover it. Plus, with your subscription, you'll also have access to thousands of articles archived on our website, which is a fantastic resource for journalists, students, researchers, analysts, anybody who's looking into this subject. We've intentionally priced the subscription rate to be affordable and accessible. It's just $7 a month for students and teachers and $15 a month for everyone else. Just go to chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe, try it out free for 2 weeks, see if you like it. Once again, that's chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, it is such a fascinating time right now in China-Africa relations and really in the Africa economy as a whole right now, because on the one hand, we're at the abyss that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia warned back in March when he said that if help does not come immediately to help bring back African economies from the pandemic and the economic crisis that the pandemic has brought about, then they will literally be standing on the abyss. And in many ways and in many countries now, they are looking into that abyss. We're seeing downgrades in a number of countries, including in South Africa, Zambia, Kenya, Ethiopia, have all received credit downgrades. Currencies are being devalued. The price of debt is going up because of those devalued currencies. We're seeing double-digit inflation now in Nigeria, in South Africa, and also in Zambia. Unemployment rates in South Africa are now north of 30%. And the list goes on of the very worrisome economic statistics that are coming about. So in so many ways, this is such a concerning time in the African economy. But Cobus, you wrote in a recent column for us that while times are bad, but not everything is gloomy. Give us the other side of the story.
Well, in the first place, Africa is proving to be quite resilient against COVID-19. Obviously, it's there's a lot of problems and it's a massive crisis. But at the same time, I think we're seeing that the continent, among other reasons, because it's developed a lot of kind of public health protocols already, because it was dealing with Ebola and with HIV. We're seeing that African countries are in some cases more resilient against COVID-19 than richer countries in the global north. In the second place, I think I agree with you that these kind of the macroeconomic moment is looking bad. However, we were also seeing on the continent itself a lot of indications that African economies are actually are proving quite resilient. So Bloomberg last week reported that Soweto's economy, so this is a large, for non-South Africans, this is a large township city outside of Johannesburg, and that its economy has actually really grown quite rapidly under COVID, among others, because the lockdown forced people to set up little businesses, which then kept the money within the community rather than spending it in Johannesburg. At the same time, on a slightly larger scale, we're also seeing that 7 out of the top 10 fastest growing economies this year will be African economies, and that apparently one of the best performing stock exchanges in the world is Nigeria's stock exchange. So there are these kind of very interesting indicators that even among really bad conditions, African economies seem to be doing better than expected.
And one other interesting aspect of that, and I'm glad you brought up Nigeria, is because last week some new trade data came out from the Chinese embassy in Abuja about China-Nigeria trade, and it showed that for the first half of the year, China-Nigeria trade is actually up 0.7%. And that's actually being repeated in a number of different countries across the continent, considering the magnitude of the shutdowns that we had both in China and in most African countries earlier this spring, the fact that China-Africa trade is going to hit somewhere around $170 billion this year is quite remarkable, all things being equal. So again, that is another upside of the story. So to help us figure out where we are in this moment, I'm just very happy for the first time to have on the show Dr. David Monier, who is the director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, and he's also the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the university. David is also a regular commentator on China-Africa relations and international relations writ large on various South African media outlets, including Daily Maverick, Independent Online. He's regularly on SABC. So he is a very popular commentator and has opinions on, it seems, absolutely everything. So we thought he would be the perfect person to help us navigate our way through these confusing times. A very good morning to you, David.
Good morning, Eric, and to all listeners. It's really indeed a pleasure speaking to you today for the first time.
It really is a pleasure. It's long overdue that you are on the show, and we're so glad to have you. So Cobus and I laid out this complex matrix of good news and bad news that we're seeing. And I think for people reading the news, it's kind of hard to figure out where we are. On the one hand, there is a lot of bad news. You see it in South Africa quite a bit. Your own country is in many ways teetering on the verge of economic collapse, at least as it's been framed in the international and the South African media. At the same time, there are strong trade numbers coming with China. There's a lot of good news, as Cobus kind of pointed out. Investment and foreign investment in Ghana is up by significantly this year. So there is some good news. Where do you think we are right now?
I think we are undergoing quite a terrible phase in the global economy. For me, I always look at history as the greatest teacher. I think we are much more back in 1930s of some sort, kind of economic depression, but of a different fashion. Here we have the global economy has expanded, as you know, and quite a number of people have been, with all the crises that we face, been uplifted from poverty. The star being China, with almost 700, 800 million people out of poverty in the past 40 years. And this has been replicated in a number of Asian countries. Even though Africa is the least developed continent on Earth, still we have witnessed in the last 2 decades somehow slow progress. However, the COVID has really thrown almost everyone really backwards in terms of the economy, and particularly Africa, in the sense that it's so integrated in the global economy and still depends on the developed countries, even though China and Asia it remains our biggest trading nations. We still depend on tourism, for instance, and we still really linked to some of the policies that are planned and executed somewhere, particularly in the developed world. But on the whole, I'm very hopeful that we will really get out of this crisis gradually. It all depends with what each and every nation on the African continent does in terms of changing the outlook. I'm very hopeful still. However, the damage that caused by COVID-19 is quite massive. We haven't even started counting yet the cost that it has brought on the continent.
So, David, if we hone in a little bit on the China-Africa relationship itself, how did you maybe what was your impression of how the relationship did during COVID? Like what kind of changes did you see COVID bringing into the relationship, and kind of how do you see that shaping, particularly kind of FOCAC next year?
Since 2006, so the China's Africa policy and the entire formation of the Africa-China Forum, which celebrates its 20th year this year, we have seen the growth of the relationship, particularly in trade, even though it's more in favor of China. However, the COVID is bringing quite a new dynamics And these are brought by planning, and others are brought by sheer accident, where new forms of economy are coming, the technology, the role of technology. And therefore, I think there's more promising, and one sees growth going forward based on what I've already mentioned.
It's interesting you brought up trade, and we got some great new numbers from the Maritime Silk Road Trade Index, which is a government index from China that's produced by the Ningbo Shipping Exchange in Zhejiang province. And what's interesting about their trade data is that they break it down by continent. And I just want to read you some of the numbers. This is from January to October of 2020. And it really is interesting because it frames Africa vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And that gives us also an idea of the importance economically to China. So total trade is $3.72 trillion in the first 3 quarters of 2020. It looks like China is going to be on pace to hit $4 trillion by the end, once again reaffirming China's role as the largest trading nation in the world. The bulk of that trade, almost half of it, comes from Asia, $1.9 trillion, $726 billion with Europe, $508 billion with North America, $256 billion in the January to October with Latin America, $160 billion with New Zealand, Australia, and Oceania, and at the end is $150 billion between China and Africa. Altogether, it's looking like China-Africa trade ties will represent about 4% of China's total global trading portfolio. So a very, very small number. And it's the argument that I've made that economically speaking, Africa is more or less insignificant to China when you look at it compared to these other regions. But Africa's political importance, diplomatic importance, it is so enormous to China. And I'm wondering, when we think about the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit that's supposed to take place next year in Dakar, in Senegal, is there an opportunity for an evolution in this, the 20th year, as you pointed out, of the relationship of FOCAC to move beyond the expectation of how big is the Chinese check going to be, to how can African countries better leverage their power that they have in political terms to extract more benefits that are better suited for their constituents? What's your take on that, David?
I really like the states that you have mentioned, but I think if we really need to think innovatively, and looking, our starting point should be Beijing. What's Beijing thinking in terms of its grand plan, a global plan, and where does Africa fit in? Yes, currently when we look at the situation, you're right to say the number appears insignificant, but the Chinese do not think like, the Western world, including Africa. We are much more Western than any other thing, but they're looking in the long term. They're looking at the continent, the vastness of the continent, its potential in terms of fertile land, in terms of agriculture and food security. They're looking at the young population and the rate of, in terms of its growth, particularly of the economies on Africa in the medium, long term. The Chinese really see Africa as much more important than other continents that you have mentioned. So while I agree with you in the short term, numbers appear to be insignificant, but the long planning within the Belt Road Initiative, I think China has a much more longer term planning and thinking.
How do you define longer term? What are we talking about in terms of years? Is this a decades or is it 5 to 10 years? What's long and medium term in practical
For
terms?
me, medium will be more of a decade, and then we're looking at your 20 years a long term. Looking at the rate of growth of Africa's economies, on the ground. And we also need to factor in the Africa's newly signed trade agreement. And the world really, it is going through this back and forth. You have insular kind of looking in Europe, Britain leaving EU, the madness that has been happening in the United States, and really it appears that the headache is over. However, big trading agreements that are taking place in Asia and Africa itself really will turn things in a positive way in the long term, in my view.
When you look forward, kind of across the medium and long term, where do you see the real engine of growth being within the China-Africa relationship? Like, are you looking at trade? Are you looking at extractives? Like more, Chinese exploration of African consumer markets? Kind of where do you think the heart of the relationship will be?
I think we're going to see new areas of growth, particularly look at the blue economy, new areas of the traditional sectors. I think will continue your extractive, but more importantly, the e-commerce and the role of technology. I think what China has been doing, which a few analysts, have really looked into the dynamism in terms of their technology and the rate of growth of that technology. It's quite fast. And then if you see on the continent, the usage of cell phones and the awareness that Africa can leapfrog in terms of its development, this in itself gives comfort to some of us if we look. And when we talk of Africa, we also have to qualify. It's not the entire continent, 54 countries. We're looking at your Nigeria, your Kenya, your South Africa, Rwanda somehow, Egypt and Algeria. So those countries, I think, will lead and will be much more plugged into Chinese economy in a much more, beyond Chinese economy in any way, in much more Asia and other areas that we have been speaking about.
Let's stay on the topic of technology since you brought it up. Back in March, in one of your Daily Maverick columns, you said there's no evidence that China and Huawei pose any threat to Africa. You resoundingly condemned the American criticism and the fear-mongering that the Americans do related to Huawei, dismissing the threats that they present out there. Give us your take on Huawei and Chinese technology in Africa.
Sure, but it's really hard to just speak of Huawei.
Or speak Chinese tech more broadly.
Indeed, broadly, these high-tech companies. I think if we look what's happening in the United States, in China itself, and all over the world hasn't come to terms with putting rules of engagement for these companies. Whether it's your Facebook, are facing problems in Europe in terms of tax and the like. And I think my starting point is that we in Africa, like all other places in the world, we do indeed have a challenge with big companies, that they are much more powerful than small nations. And therefore, there is a need for a rule-based world order. There's a need to have rules that apply to these companies like all others. But having said that, when it comes to Huawei specifically, we also have to say there's huge competition. I can't go deeper into it. You are quite aware of it. In terms of competition of the rise of Huawei in the United States and how under Donald Trump, how United States is really shocked in the manner in which Huawei has really surpassed quite a number of American companies. And in dealing with Huawei, there has been this allegations made. And when it comes to Africa, one really does not defend Huawei, saying that it doesn't have problems in other areas. But when it comes to South Africa specifically and the continent, I haven't come across any evidence that will convince me that indeed Huawei is spying and Huawei is doing all these allegations that are leveled against it.
But what about the African Union, the allegations that Le Monde put forward and that were apparently confirmed by the Financial Times that Huawei was in fact bugging and spying on the African Union headquarters a couple of years ago?
That was a big story, but the AU itself came to refute the very same allegations. And therefore, as I said, there are problems. One does not know the level of what really happened in that building. As we don't have the evidence. We just had allegation. As much as we have allegations of Facebook and others, that American companies that have been doing quite a lot of things that we have problems with. So I think my view is not I just have issue to select one company out of many that are having a huge problem in terms of how they interact with society, whether it comes to data protection, people's rights in terms of keeping their own data, as well as how they interface with elections, how they change and shape and they influence our youth. Their impact on democracy is happening in the United States. There's a whole list of things that we really need to put on the table and discuss alongside Huawei issues.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
You mentioned the United States. It seems to me that despite the Biden win, I don't see necessarily that we'll see a really big change in general U.S. kind of approaches to China, particularly a kind of a across the aisle consensus in the U.S. that China is in the first place is a problem for the U.S. and then in the second place needs to be contained in some kind of way. And I guess, I'm guessing that that the big change will be one of style, in the sense that I think the Biden administration will be a lot more open to coalition building and will try and kind of put more pressure on traditional allies to join it in this kind of approach to China. How do you see this playing in Africa, and how do you see a more attractive, more kind of democracy-minded kind of American administration? How do you see that relationship with Africa evolving?
Excellent question, Cobus. I think the crisis that we face here in Africa is that there's so much talk from the West, there's so much talk, and there's no walking the talk. And what do I mean by that? Going back to our previous question, with regards to Huawei, all these allegations that are being made, and competition and the rise of Huawei on the African continent. It has offices all over the continent. What we don't see, the lack of appetite by Western big giants. They look at Africa as not attractive enough. And therefore, I think what confuses us as analysts is that there's so much blame on China, rightly or wrongly, but it is not really followed up by serious investments and serious really looking into how to rival Huawei. And therefore, I think that's what we see. However, looking at Biden's policy, I think he's going to, in relation to China and specifically Africa, I think we're going to see much more shift in the US. Instead of going nakedly attacking Huawei in the manner in which Trump has been doing, I think Biden will build coalition, as you rightly put it. But beyond that, I think he's going to build a much more smart policy. More importantly, investing more resources. There's going to be a shift, your industrial policy, a term that normally is not used in the United States, in terms of massive investment in technology. And somehow a bigger role for the US state in areas where American private sector is not playing a key role in dealing with China. Therefore, I think one is really excited on one hand that you're going to have a much more stronger rising China and a really shifting US views. And the continent really needs a strong US economically, as well as China. Both partners are quite critical for Africa's own quest for development.
But beyond economics, you were very clear again, I'm going to quote your columns here. In a column back in September, you said Africa must look east to revive economy post-COVID-19. So considering that you're very enthusiastic about Africa engaging China and whatnot, now with the new Biden administration, what would you advise the incoming Biden administration about how to best position themselves in terms of Africa. Economy is one part of it, but the United States has also played a role in public health, particularly in a place like South Africa with PEPFAR. They've played in democracy promotion, human rights. These are all areas that the Chinese do not actively engage in. And even China's public health initiatives in Africa are very, very small compared to what USAID and traditional donors do. So what would you advise both the Biden administration and maybe even African stakeholders on how to maximize the relationship in order to get the best out of the US and the best out of China?
The challenge that the Biden administration will have is that it will concentrate much more domestically. And on one hand, really advancing human rights, democracy. But the lessons that we have learned since the end of Cold War is that democracy not backed by economic development, it remains a mirage. All this liberal international order, it's really falling apart, as I said in the beginning. We're going back to 1930s. And therefore, I think to really support human rights, democracy language, it has to be followed by a building of roads, harbors, and something that China is doing well. So I think what we need is that to balance what United States in terms of the health of the ballot box, and on the other hand, what I consider is the democracy of the belly. We need to eat. We can't eat at the ballot box only. We need to balance these two, and that's what the Biden administration has to really seriously look at in terms of investing, not from a very narrow U.S. interest. Of course, nations are driven by their interests, pouring in U.S. troops, guarding its interests against China, but really looking at genuine, in a respectful way, engaging the African nations in a substantive way, something that hasn't been happening. So that's one point. At the second point, Biden was the vice president, and we are aware that he opposed the Libyan war. That remains Obama's crisis on the African continent. Really avoiding this notion of regime change. Find a better way of supporting those who are pro-democracy on the African continent without really destroying existing structures of state that we have. The lessons of Libya and what is happening in Egypt and the like doesn't really leave Africa with a good picture of what we need and supporting U.S. agenda on the African continent. Therefore, I think we need to balance. So I think my last point on this is that we have to look at Africa's agents. We are not, as Africans, not really pro-China nor pro-Washington. We have our own plans, the Agenda 2063 that drives our development agenda, and we really need our strategic partners to engage us in uplifting our people out of poverty.
So, keeping on the issue of human rights, you've now focused on Africa as a party kind of acted upon by external actors in relation to Libya, for example. But if you look at Africa as a human rights actor in the international world, we've seen in forums like the UN, African countries, including Muslim majority countries, expressing support for China's positions in Xinjiang. So do you see, is there an African unified idea or sets of thinking about human rights, and how do you foresee that actually being expressed in relation to outside actors, kind of when it isn't African human rights at question, but the human rights of other people?
I think the African continent is largely informed by not interfering in internal affairs. And there has been an understanding, I think the change from OAU to AU, quite sensitive on a number of areas, given our lesson of Rwanda genocide and the like. And therefore, I think there's quite a lot of sensitivity of what's happening everywhere, including China. I think where most African countries, in the AU in particular, differ in terms of the narrative coming from the West is the selective nature of a human rights regime. where you really look at Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at the expense of Yemen, at the expense of Saudi Arabia, at the expense of places where some Western countries have core interests, and really assisting some of the world's greatest dictators, brutal leaders who are killing their people daylight. And I think that brings quite a confusion. And one is excited to hear Biden saying he won't support Yemen in terms of supplying them with weapons and the like. I think there's a need to change the lenses in which we analyze this human rights question without being selective and targeting one specific country.
It's now December, so we're going to do what we do every year at this time of year. We start looking back on the year that was. And since we have you here, I'd like to ask you a couple questions when we look back at 2020. It was a monumental year, even beyond what happened with COVID-19. And I'd like to take us back to April, when the incidents in Guangzhou and the videos started appearing on social media of discrimination, of racism, of the mistreatment of African residents in Guangzhou, people being evicted from their homes and their hotels and put out on the streets. What impact, when you look back on this now, 7-8 months later, what impact do you think that had, that incident, in terms of civil society and people-to-people ties between African countries and African residents and Chinese in general?
I think what Africa and China have, I think it's a better channels of communication. I think what that event did was to really change the narrative. I think there was a lot of honesty on both parties. The Nigerian High Commission raising issues. And there has been some discussion and acknowledgement by the Chinese government that a number of things did indeed go wrong. And those discussions are really bringing us to your much more mature, getting into more issues in terms of moving away from government to people, and opening up a new way of communicating. Because really, the Chinese and Africans haven't been communicated to that lower level. It is always high level. I think what that event did is to pose questions. And I think one of it is that, can Africans be racist to Chinese? And can Chinese be racist to Africans, given the fact we are both global south from Bandung up to now? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're being asked. I think scholars are starting to really get into it in a much more open way. It will take time. That kind of narrative differs from your narrative we have with Western countries that has always been centered on issues of race vividly. And the other part is the rise of technology. As we say about the changes in the US and how we followed the elections in the United States, this year has brought up new things. We are now able to zoom in into areas that we haven't had access to through cell phone videos and the like.
So, one of the trends that we saw in 2020 was actually, I think, a trend that started already in 2019, which is indications that China is becoming a lot more risk averse in terms of large scale lending for African infrastructure. And I think now, 2020 has hastened that trend, and COVID has hastened that trend, particularly now with a bunch of African countries falling into debt distress. So it looks like there's a kind of a consensus emerging among analysts that China will probably be lending a lot less to Africa over the next few years, particularly for infrastructure. So how do you see that kind of impacting, and how do you think what would be a better way for Africa to fund its infrastructure?
Yes and no, Cobus. I think we have to look at the thinking in Beijing. The Belt and Road, I think, goes beyond all the crisis we currently face in terms of global economic downturn. And therefore, I think the Chinese will be very selective, yes. However, there's certain key strategic infrastructure that are central. that will not stop. I think they will continue. However, there might be changes in terms of the way of funding, in a way dealing with some of the concern raised in the West and on the African continent. Also bringing in the whole issue of environment protection. And you hear the narrative in Beijing really changing, try to adjust. I think what China does best is to listen to criticism without saying and adjust its move. And that's the brilliance part of its Belt and Road initiative. It will go, however, pause wherever there's a crisis, adjust, but nonetheless not really stopping. In key areas such as Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, what's happening, and really focus on South Africa, given the fact that South Africa has these two oceans, and it's also a bridge to Latin America. I think there's going to be more efforts to try to bring South Africa on board on Belt and Road Initiative.
Let's stay with our look back at 2020 and debt sustainability, debt restructuring, debt relief, the DSSI with the G20. All of those played very prominently this year. How do you think the Chinese have done so far in terms of the restructuring talks in places like Angola, Zambia? There's discussions apparently going on in Kenya. Ethiopia and Djibouti also have high levels of Chinese debt. Private creditors have complained bitterly that the lack of Chinese transparency has made it difficult for them to restructure debt in places like Zambia. David Malpass at the World Bank and also the IMF have also complained about the lack of Chinese engagement in the DSSI, or at least the way that they expect them to behave within the G20 and the DSSI. So there's been a lot of tension in the debt relief process. From your vantage point, how do you think the Chinese have done overall?
I think they've done well as far as the plan that they had, and they have been rolling over the past 2 decades. The issue is an issue of norms and values. We're dealing with two systems. Your Western, backed by the OECD, those norms in terms of how to borrow, and China moves from a completely different way of thinking. However, I think the African continent and most of these economies are really having challenge. But having said all this, the debt on the African continent does not start and end with China. It's much more bigger. I think our largest debt is with Western countries. And therefore, I think the Chinese are more in terms of leaning towards we need a comprehensive, not just looking at China, but looking at the entire debt question on the African continent. And therefore, we're going to reschedule some of it, but we shouldn't be the only ones doing this. Everyone should play the game within G20 and other platforms. I think we're going to see more of that kind of story coming forth.
You know, if you look forward over the next few years, how do you see China-Africa relations evolving? You know, kind of if we, for example, if we're looking towards 2030, what role do you foresee China-Africa relations playing in the larger global, you know, kind of geopolitical context?
I think China gives Africa the biggest lesson in terms of how best to deal with key issues that Africa is battling with, how to deal with issues of infrastructure development, the whole connectivity issue, which really lacks on the African continent, and dealing with the rural development, poverty alleviation. I think those lessons will be learned by most African countries to a much more larger extent. And Africa's own integration, I think it's picking pace. And while Africa will remain a larger part in terms of its trade and political relation with China, but the thinking will go beyond just China. I think it's a question of Africa trying to link broadly with Asia and ensure that it diversifies its economy, not just Western countries and China, but getting to other countries such as your Philippines, your former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe countries, and perhaps using the alternative trading routes that China is building currently through the Belt and Road Initiative. And therefore, I think you're going to see this relationship having tensions in some areas in terms of balancing trade and crisis in other areas where China will be forced to defend most of its development on the African continent, and really serious differences in terms of how it goes about doing it. But on the whole, you're going to have your Africa-China Forum really dealing and solving some of this crisis in a much more balanced way.
Well, that's a great way for us to end our discussion on a positive, hopeful note. Dr. David Monyae is the director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg and also the co-director of the Confucius Institute, also based in the university. He writes a lot, and we publish a lot of what he does on our social media channels. You'll see him in the Daily Maverick, Independent Online, SABC, CGTN. You've also written for lots of different places. David, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It was fascinating to hear your view across all of those issues. Rarely do we get a commentator like you who can speak so competently on everything as much as you've done. So that was very exciting. If people want to connect with you and follow what you're reading and writing, what's the best way? You're on Twitter.
Yes, you can reach me. I'm at David Monyae, as well as my email address is David Monyae, Monyae as in MONYAE at uj.ac.za. I'm also on Facebook. So those are areas that and channels that people can use.
Wonderful. We will put links to all of those in the show notes so that you can follow what David is reading and writing and to stay in touch with his publications. Once again, thanks, David. We really appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
Cobus, it's so refreshing to hear a voice like David's that is so, it's just, I don't know what the word is, because we're so used to hearing the skeptics of China-Africa relations who have strong voices in Washington, in Europe, and to hear David's enthusiasm and optimism for the relationship is not actually something we hear very often. And the way that he is so confident about it, and it's really strongly based in fact. Again, there's a lot of different positions on this. You can see, and this is the complexity of China-Africa relations. You can see it from lots of different angles. But I really enjoyed hearing his confidence and his optimism in terms of where this relationship is going, in part because it's not something that we hear that often.
Yeah, he also, obviously, David brings to the table this really broad vision, which is fantastic. You know, so he looks at so many different aspects of the relationship at once, from a very informed position. So it's really a treat to speak with him.
In some ways, it felt like a counter narrative. In some ways, that he was really pushing back against many of the more kind of, again, very vocal media narratives and academic scholarly narratives that come out of places like the US that tend to be very skeptical of the Chinese. And he comes at it from a very different point of view.
Yeah. Do you share his kind of vision of how it's going to go with FOCAC next year, and also, you know, kind of how the China-Africa relationship is going to proceed for the next 10 years or so?
Not entirely. I'm not as optimistic as he is, though I do share his idea on a long-term vision that the Chinese are definitely thinking longer term in many ways. So in that sense, I 100% fully agree with him. I'm not sure that African governments, and again, I may be wrong here, so I will freely admit that, have evolved their thinking on China as much as I think they need to, and the way that the Chinese have evolved their thinking of Africa. This is what I wrote about in today's column for the newsletter, where the power that African governments have in negotiating with China is not going to be on economic terms, it's going to be on political terms. And I'm not seeing the coalitions come together among African countries to be able to form a bloc that negotiates tougher terms with the Chinese on certain issues. What I fear is going to happen next year at FOCAC is just a repetition of the previous FOCACs that we've seen, which is how much money are we going to get? What is the size of the check? The big announcement that comes out of FOCAC every year, first it was, 10 billion, then 20 billion, then 60 billion, and everybody focuses on those numbers. And I'm not sure that's the healthiest relationship, either for China, which is really not in the mood right now to be spending a whole lot of cash on these kinds of things. As we've talked about, again, in today's newsletter, and one of the trends we're seeing lately is this pullback in lending, this more emphasis on feasibility, path to profitability, return on investment, and not just funding billion-dollar railroads anywhere they can. There probably is going to be a very big pullback on that money. So I would be skeptical if the Chinese are going to come to FOCAC with a lot of money. They may come with trade incentives, tax incentives, and they can get to a big number, but you're really going to have to dissect how they got to that number. It's not just going to be the cash handouts that we've seen in the past. Are African stakeholders, governments, organizations, companies, have they kind of mobilized their new strategies on how to engage this new world and this new China? I'm not entirely sure. I haven't seen evidence of that. But that being said, people on Twitter have openly corrected me when I've expressed those doubts. So I do leave a little bit of room to be corrected that may not, in fact, be the case, that Africans are going into FOCAC with a different agenda. I hope that they are, because if they're just bringing in the 2018 and the 2015 and the 2012 FOCAC plan, then they're going to be in real trouble.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I agree. I tend to agree with David that I think certain kind of high-profile symbolic infrastructure projects will probably keep being financed by China. Not, probably a lot less, and probably a lot less in terms of money and a lot fewer in terms of projects. But I don't foresee kind of infrastructure lending disappearing completely. Among others, because it does play such a strong symbolic role both in the realm of the BRI and in China-Africa relations. So if as you have argued that the Chinese relationship with Africa is leaning stronger in the political direction than in, say, the trade and economic direction, then the optics and the symbolism of things like big infrastructure will continue to be salient, I think, in the relationship, and that will probably continue. What I wonder is, kind of like he briefly mentioned, the idea. And I think this is a very strong narrative that both China and Africa are global South countries, and that South-South solidarity remains really at the heart of the relationship. I think that's going to be. I think that's true. I agree with him in that sense, but it's going to be very interesting to see how that narrative evolves over the next 10 years, particularly if, as many have predicted, by 2030, China might be officially the world's largest economy. So it'll be very interesting to see whether it's possible to maintain any kind of narrative of South-South solidarity in, when that happens.
I don't know where you're getting the confidence that China will keep up those infrastructure investments, because if what happened in Latin America in 2019 is any evidence, then it may not be the case. Energy financing in Latin America from the Chinese dropped off a cliff to literally almost nothing in 2019. And it went from huge to nothing. And so I think that we express that as a hope, but there are a lot of demands on the Chinese budgets right now. There are a lot of geostrategic demands on the Chinese. I think based on what we saw, look at the trade numbers, $1.9 trillion of trade in the first 8 months of the year, 9 months of the year, sorry. First 9 months of this year is with Asia. They're going to direct a lot of infrastructure building into Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And I'm just not convinced that we're going to see huge amounts of money. Maybe there's going to be some just to keep up appearances, but it's not going to be necessarily very significant. And if Latin America is anything to go by, a non-strategic part of the world for the Chinese, in many ways like Africa, they clearly showed that they're willing to pull back very quick and very hard from infrastructure financing in places like Latin America. So I think a word of caution should be introduced into that discussion.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I think we're roughly kind of saying the same thing in different language, in the sense that, that as you say, like there'll be some continued investment to keep up appearances, to not have the narrative of, China's now withdrawing from Africa. Like a certain amount of infrastructure funding is necessary to keep up those appearances. And I would tend to think that would then take the case of kind of when you look at it from a full perspective, there'll be a sharp decline. But in terms of the kind of narratives, the news, the press releases and so on, certain kind of high profile projects will probably go ahead. And I would guess, that those might well take the form of particularly focused on ICT, simply because this is a place, this is one place where an actor like Huawei isn't facing a lot of pushback. It's a place where they could then use widespread network rollout as part of a kind of a diplomatic narrative as well. And it is something that would kind of create, on the back end opportunities for other Chinese, large-scale Chinese actors to then also move in. So in that sense, I tend to agree with David that I think something like e-commerce on the back of Chinese-built ICT networks will then fulfill this kind of double whammy of being both potentially making money for Chinese companies while using Chinese kind of infrastructure investment as this kind of narrative of continued development.
It's interesting because one of the trends that I've noticed in putting together the newsletter over the past, say, 2 months in particular is the number of contracting deals. These are the EPC deals where China or Chinese state-owned enterprises and state-owned contracting companies and construction firms are building out an Africa Development Bank project or a GE project. They are the contractor. And all of them, without exception, are state-backed. And so maybe one of the things we might see is that the state subsidies go to support the EPC role. That is, they're going to play a secondary role as a contractor of choice. And boy, the number of contracts in the past 6 or 7 weeks that the Chinese have closed and won for roads and hydroelectric dams and the new administrative capital in Cairo, which has been under development for several years now. And we're seeing this all again as an EPC role. So it might not be that China is going to lend the money and build the railroad like they did with the standard gauge railway. But what they might do is let the African Development Bank and others put up the loan, and then the Chinese come in with the most competitive bid for the contracting. And the government is backstopping the Chinese contractors with Sinosure, who normally plays an insurance role in the front end part of the investment with the loans, maybe playing an insurance role in the back end part as the EPC provider. That might be an evolution of the role. So we still see a lot of Chinese activity in Africa, but the risk level for the Chinese is significantly lower because the loan isn't being extended by a Chinese policy bank. That may be one area. I agree with you also that tech is going to be another. Expect in 2020, and we're starting already our preview and review things, I think Alibaba is going to come into Africa in a very big way. We've started to see now AliExpress making inroads into places like Zambia this year. Alibaba's been late coming into Africa, but because their world is getting much, much smaller in places like the US and Europe, Africa now looks a lot more appealing than it did even just a few years ago. So in the tech space, there might be a whole lot of new energy with the likes of Alibaba and Tencent coming in to develop their markets and also to bring some of the technology that served them so well in other developing markets like here in Southeast Asia, where Alibaba has the Lazada brand. So they've done logistics in these kind of very dynamic markets that don't have good infrastructure, that don't have good payment systems, and they can bring some of that expertise into Africa as well. So two trends that I think might play out next year. Final thoughts to you, Cobus.
I think, one of the big things that's going to be really important in making these predictions, and one of the things that we'll be focusing on a lot more in future episodes is going to be how the Chinese government's own economic planning, particularly in relation to its recent five-year plan, is going to impact its relationship with Africa. Like the rise of concepts like dual circulation and so on is going to be really important to unpack, and we'll hopefully be doing that in future episodes. But I think it's really important to keep an eye on those in making these kind of projections.
It's an interesting point that you bring up because there's not enough emphasis on following Chinese domestic politics in the African media. So often when it's about China, it's always in a China-Africa context. But in order to understand what the Chinese are doing in Africa, you must first understand what the domestic politics are, which drive their policies elsewhere in places like Africa. So to your point, understanding the 5-year plan, concepts like dual circulation, this emphasis on self-sustainability in terms of technology. Obviously, that's focused more on the United States and less on Africa. But nonetheless, understanding Chinese domestic politics. I think we're overdue to have a Chinese domestic political analyst to come on and explain some of these things. So that would be one of the shows that we look in. Also in December, we're going to have more looking back on 2020. We'll end the year with our annual show that Cobus and I have been doing for 10 years now, which is our year in review, year in preview. We'll do that towards the end of the year. But we have some great guests lined up for you coming up in December. And so we hope that you'll continue to join us. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. If you want to follow all the topics that we talked about today, the best way to do it is to sign up for our daily email newsletter. Try it out free for 2 weeks. Go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Boy, it is a deep dive, and it's the only thing that's out there that's like this, and it's something that we're incredibly proud of. We're really grateful to our reader community around the world who gives us all this feedback and has this great discussion going on. And we cover basically every detail of China-Africa relations that goes on every single day. Also, one thing, if you're a scholar or a researcher or an analyst, our website is now a treasure trove of archived information. So we're publishing about 10 stories a day on the newsletter that get loaded onto the website. And so every news story for the past year now is on the website, and it's all searchable. So that comes with your membership as well. So $7 if you're a student or a teacher a month, and then $15 a month for everybody else. So it's a great deal. It's a great resource. We'd love for you to become part of it. Once again, ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to Cobus and I. We're very easy to get in touch with. I'm at Eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com, ERIC, and Cobus is at Cobus@ChinaAfricaProject.com, COBUS. So for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thanks so much for listening. See you then.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/ChinaAfricaProject to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus @Stadinsky or Eric @EOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.